may know this feeling. One day you feel like you're the only person in the room who actually understands what's happening, like your mind operates on a level that most people can't access. And on that same day, maybe even that same hour, you feel like you can barely function, like something in you is fundamentally wrong, and no amount of intelligence will fix it. A prophet at noon, a fraud by dinner, and no stable ground between them. But what if the most brilliant and the most broken parts of you were never separate? For many deep intuitives, INFJs, INTJs, INFPs, and INTPs, this oscillation isn't random, it's structural. And there is a precise name for what drives it. Carl Jung mapped it decades before the self-help industry started selling you half-truths about either side. But before I give you that name, I need to show you how this pattern was built, because it started earlier than you think. There are nights when your mind moves through ideas with a clarity that feels almost superhuman. You see connections no one taught you to see. You understand things about people, about systems, about the way the world actually works beneath what it pretends to be. And in those moments, you feel a quiet certainty that you operate on a frequency most people will never access. And then you can't return a phone call. You sit in your car for 20 minutes before walking into a grocery store. You watch other people navigate ordinary life with an ease that feels like a foreign language, and something in you whispers that you are fundamentally broken, not struggling, not having a bad day, but built wrong, in a way that no amount of effort or insight will ever repair. This is not a mood disorder, this is not imposter syndrome, and if either of those is part of your picture, what I'm describing may still operate underneath them. What you're experiencing has a precise structure, and it was installed in you before you were old enough to resist it. At 5 or 6, you were already perceiving things that the adults around you either couldn't see or refused to acknowledge. The tension between your parents that nobody named, the sadness your mother carried beneath her functioning, the anger your father expressed sideways, never directly. You registered all of it, not intellectually, but somatically. You felt it in your body before you had a single word for what you were feeling. And here is where the wound begins. Because a child who perceives at that depth needs one specific thing from their environment: accurate mirroring. They need someone to say, in words or in presence, yes, you're seeing what you're seeing, and it's real, and you're not too much for seeing it. You didn't get that. Almost none of you did. What you got instead was a double message, and this double message is the origin of everything you're living now. On one side, you were told you were too much, too sensitive, too intense, too complicated, too emotional. You asked questions that made adults uncomfortable. You pointed at things the family had silently agreed to ignore, and the message was clear. What you perceive is a problem. Tone it down. Be normal. On the other side, simultaneously, you were not enough. Not sporty enough, not social enough, not easy enough, not the kind of child the environment knew how to celebrate. The things you excelled at, the deep thinking, the pattern recognition, the emotional precision, those weren't valued. And the things you couldn't do, small talk, casual friendship, performing enthusiasm for things that bored you, those were treated as failures. Too much and not enough. At the same time. About the same child. By 15, this double message had hardened into a psychic structure. You had learned to oscillate because your environment taught you that you could never simply be. You were either extraordinary or defective, and the ground between those two positions had been removed before you ever had a chance to stand on it. By 20, you had built two internal identities without realizing it. One that secretly believed it saw deeper than almost anyone, and one that secretly believed it was broken in a way that could never be repaired. Both felt absolutely true. Neither was. Now here is where I'm going to tell you something that will be difficult to hear, precisely because both sides of this oscillation have become comfortable, and once you see why they're comfortable, you won't be able to unsee it. The self-help world has validated the more than human side. You've been told you're an empath, a highly sensitive person, a deep soul in a shallow world. You've been sorted into personality types that confirm your exceptionality. And that felt good because it gave the inflated position a name and a community. But it never resolved the oscillation. Because underneath every video that told you how rare and gifted you are, the other voice was still whispering, if you're so gifted, why can't you hold a job without burning out, maintain a relationship without disappearing, or get through a single week without a collapse that no one around you would understand? And therapy culture has validated the less-than-human side. You've been given diagnoses, attachment styles, trauma frameworks. You've been told you're wounded and that healing means slowly becoming functional. But that framework never accounted for the part of you that isn't wounded at all, the part that perceives with devastating accuracy and knows things it was never taught. Telling that part it needs healing is like telling a surgeon their hands are a symptom. Neither framework works because neither addresses the actual structure. They each treat one pole and ignore the other. And as long as you're identified with either pole, you will keep oscillating, because inflation and deflation are not opposites. They are dance partners. One cannot exist without the other. Jung called this identification with archetypal contents. In simple terms, it means your mind temporarily becomes something larger than you, and then collapses when it can't sustain it. When the ego merges with an archetype, whether the wise one, the healer, the seer, it inflates. It feels godlike. But Jung was precise about what follows. Inflation always produces its compensatory deflation. The psyche demands balance. The higher you fly on borrowed archetypal energy, the harder the collapse when the ego remembers it is not a god. It is a human being, and it was never meant to carry that weight. If this is the first video of mine that's found you, subscribe. What comes next goes deeper. And stay with me here, because what I'm about to describe next is the moment this pattern breaks, not when you choose to confront it, but when reality forces the confrontation. And if this hasn't happened to you yet, it will. This is the part you need to hear before it arrives. It often arrives through someone who sees both sides of you and names neither one correctly. A partner who is drawn to your depth, but eventually calls you unstable. A friend who admires your insight but pulls away because your intensity exhausts them. A parent who is proud of your intelligence but confused by your inability to just be normal with it. The breaking point isn't the rejection itself. It's the realization that they're not entirely wrong. You are unstable, not because you're ill, but because you've been living on two platforms that were never meant to hold a whole person. The brilliant one and the broken one. And both of them are performances, constructed in childhood to manage an environment that couldn't hold what you actually are. Jung called this moment the collapse of the persona. But for someone caught in the inflation-deflation cycle, it's more specific than that. It's the collapse of both personas simultaneously. The gifted one and the damaged one fall apart at the same time, and what's left is terrifying. Because what's left, before the reconstruction begins, is no identity at all. Just a human being without a story about why they're special or why they're broken. And that emptiness, that place of having no narrative to stand on, is precisely where individuation begins. Not from the inflated position, not from the deflated one, from the ground between them that was taken from you before you could walk. Before I continue, I want you to do one thing. If you have lived on both sides of this oscillation, if you know what it feels like to be more than human and less than human in the same day, drop the word both in the comments. Just that one word, nothing else. I'll come back to it. What happens next unfolds in a sequence that Jung documented across decades of clinical observation, and it will contradict almost everything you've been told about growth. There are three movements. The first will feel like loss. The second will feel like dying. The third will feel like nothing, and that nothing is the entire point. The first movement is the withdrawal of identification from the more than human position. This is the hardest part, and it's where most people turn back. Because the grandiose self isn't just vanity. It's the primary defense structure your psyche built to survive the shame of the depleted core. Letting it go feels like dying. You're not losing arrogance. You're losing the only thing that made the pain bearable. This is the phase where you stop needing to be the wisest person in the room, where you stop collecting insights as proof of your value, where you let yourself not know something, not see the pattern, not have the deeper read. And the people who admired your depth will notice. Some will say you've lost your edge, that you seem dulled, ordinary. They'll mean it as concern. It will feel like confirmation that without the inflation, you're nothing. You are not nothing. You are arriving for the first time at your actual size. And your actual size, while less dramatic than the archetype you are carrying, is solid in a way the inflated self never was. The second movement is the integration of the less-than-human position. This means confronting the shame directly, not through more analysis, not through another framework, but by letting yourself feel the full weight of the deficiency without running to the grandiose position for rescue. You sit with the feeling of being broken. You let it take up the whole room. You might remember the exact moment it began. Maybe you were 9 years old and you said something at the dinner table that was true, and the silence that followed taught you that your perception was dangerous. Maybe you were 12 and you watched a group of kids do something effortlessly social, and you felt the gap between you and them like a physical wall. You go back to that moment, and instead of explaining it away or rising above it, you stay in it. You let the child who decided they were defective finally be heard without being rescued. And you discover something that changes everything. The brokenness isn't real. It was a child's interpretation of a gap between their perception and their environment's capacity to receive it. You weren't broken, you were unmirrored, and there is a vast structural difference between the two. The broken one needs fixing. The unmirrored one needs witnessing, and those are entirely different psychological tasks. If you feel something in this space speaks to you, you can support the work through membership. You'll get early access to selected videos along with a few extra perks. Now here is the part that no framework, no personality test, no therapist on Instagram will ever tell you, because it is the least sellable idea in psychology. The third movement is the recovery of the ground. Not special, not broken, just present, just human, just here. The psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott had a name for this. He called it the capacity to be ordinary. Think about that phrase for a moment, not the achievement of ordinariness, the capacity for it, as if being ordinary were a skill, something difficult that must be developed. For people like you, it is. It may be the hardest thing you ever learn. And what Jung understood as the ego properly related to the self is the same achievement that Winnicott was pointing at, the ability to be human-sized, not inflated by archetypal identification, not deflated by shame, just you standing on ground that finally holds. It looks like this. You're at a dinner table on a Tuesday evening. Someone tells a story. It's not particularly deep. You laugh anyway, not performing, not analyzing their attachment style, not quietly ranking your intelligence against theirs, just laughing, just being a person at a table, and for the first time, that's enough. This sounds simple. For someone whose entire identity has been organized around the polarity of extraordinary and defective, it is the most radical thing you will ever do. When you stop oscillating, the people around you will react as if something has gone wrong. The ones who are drawn to your intensity will feel abandoned. Your depth was their mirror, your grandiosity, their entertainment, your collapses, their permission to feel needed. When you stop performing both extremes, they lose the version of you that served their own unexamined needs. The ones who tried to fix you will feel confused. They built a role around your brokenness. Your stability threatens their identity as helper, healer, the one who understands you. And a few, very few, will meet you in the middle. They won't need you to be extraordinary. They won't need you to be damaged. They'll simply sit with you in the unremarkable experience of being two human beings in a room, and that will feel more intimate than anything the extremes ever produced. You'll grieve the loss of the grandiose self. It was magnificent. It was also a cage. You'll grieve the loss of the broken self. It was painful, but it was familiar, and familiarity has its own gravity. Letting go of both means entering a kind of psychological adulthood that most people avoid for their entire lives because ordinary life, fully inhabited, is more demanding than any extreme. So let me tell you who you actually are now that the performances have stopped. You are not the person who sees what others can't. You are a person who was born with perceptual depth that most people don't carry. That depth is real, it is innate, but your environment turned it into a survival tool. And somewhere along the way, the tool became your identity. The sensitivity is yours. The story that it makes you exceptional is not. It is a capacity, and a capacity is something you use, not something you are. You are not the person who is fundamentally broken. You are a person whose early environment couldn't mirror what you brought into the world, and in the absence of that mirroring, you built a story of deficiency to explain the gap. That story served you. It no longer does. What remains when both stories dissolve is someone who can perceive without inflating, who can struggle without collapsing, who can sit in a room full of people and feel neither above them nor beneath them, just among them. Jung wrote that individuation does not produce saints or geniuses. It produces whole human beings. And wholeness is not a peak experience. It is the quiet, persistent act of staying in the center when everything in your conditioning pulls you toward one extreme or the other. The extraordinary and the defective were always the same movement, two arms of a single defense reaching in opposite directions to avoid the terrifying simplicity of just being here, just being enough, not more, not less, enough. Now, if you dropped the word both in the comments earlier, scroll down. You may find others who wrote the same word, people who have never met each other but who have lived the same inner war. And that single word, repeated by strangers, is proof of something the inflated self could never accept and the broken self could never believe. You are not alone in this. You never were. And here is the harder question I promised. Which side of the oscillation have you been more identified with? The one who secretly believes they see deeper than almost everyone? Or the one who secretly believes they're too broken to function? Can you see how the one you chose has been protecting you from the other? Tell me that in the comments. Not the comfortable answer, but the real one. I write about this in longer form on my Substack, The Hidden Chamber. The link is in the description. What I write there goes places a video can't go, but here is what I want to leave you with. That ground you recovered isn't emptiness. It feels like emptiness at first because you've been conditioned to recognize yourself only in the extremes. Without the highs of inflation or the familiar ache of deflation, you may feel invisible to yourself, as if you've disappeared. You haven't disappeared. You've arrived. For the first time, you're standing on ground that doesn't shift, not the borrowed height of an archetype, not the sinkhole of childhood shame, just the ordinary, sturdy, unremarkable ground of being a person who knows what they see, doesn't need it to make them special, carries their limitations without making them tragic, and moves through the world at human scale. You wake up on a Saturday with nothing to prove, you make coffee, you sit with the quiet, and the quiet doesn't scare you because you're not waiting for the inflation to return or the collapse to arrive. You're just here, and here is enough. That's not less than what you had before. It's more. It just doesn't announce itself.